Okay, chapter 21 takes a look at the impacts of industrialization on society. It focuses a little bit more on really the social aspects of industrialization, what it does to the various classes. So, the chapter begins taking a look at industrialization in Europe and on the continent. Well, we've already talked a little bit about what's been going on in England. Okay, so this takes a more closer look at what's going on the continent. So you'll read about what's going on in Belgium, in France, in Germany here as industrialization spreads onto the continent. And of course, one of the big places that affects is England as well, as railroads and other things start to develop, as England begins to tap into its coal reserves and its iron ore reserves. Of course, that's going to be a big thing as well. Of course, you see the spread of industrialization into Germany as well. And you guys can read about what all this means, especially the development of railroads, the development of steamships, and road building. All that stuff is really important and pretty self-explanatory as you do your reading. But one of the things that I want to focus on in this lecture is when we get into these social impacts of industrialization. And sometimes these aren't as easy to talk about for students. They don't see the connection here. That really it's a snowball effect. As industry gets bigger and bigger, it starts really impacting other things around it. For example, the cities. Okay, industrialization leads to urbanization, the rapid growth of cities. Take a look at Manchester. Okay, Manchester in England grew from 20,000 people in 1750 to 250,000 in 1831 to 400,000 by 1850. So a lot of times these cities grow so fast that they outstrip that city's ability to provide services, to provide clean water, and living conditions in many of these cities, especially for the working poor, can be really difficult. Cities are overcrowded. That means disease can run rampant. They're polluted. People have respiratory problems. Infant mortality is high. Tuberculosis. People living close together can spread. Low life expectancy as a result. So it has a major impact on really these new classes that are emerging as a result of the industrial revolution as well. The really new classes have developed because we don't deal with the old feudal arrangement of lords and knights and peasants. You're starting to see classes based on economic difference. Wealthy capitalists at the top, working poor at the bottom. The uh, the middle class is one of these creations of the Industrial Revolution. Sometimes we don't exactly know what middle class is. It's a word that gets thrown around, and a lot of people don't really understand that. In the 1800s, the middle classes included people like lawyers, doctors, professors, educated professionals, technicians, managers, okay, salespeople, engineers. Okay, those were middle class, and they were better off than the working poor, of course, but they are certainly not the richest as well. Many of them would go on to be educated. A university education sort of guaranteed middle class status. New universities are founded during this time. So education becomes really important to the middle class. You'll also see them try to fight for respect. You'll see things that will developed like the temperance movement, the anti-alcohol movement, for example, the working hard, the development really of that sort of hard-working middle class mentality. The You'll see as well this idea of really the who the middle class is, what their home life is like, what marriage and family life is like, and that's very different from the working classes, which is really much different. You can characterize really the working class as a group of people who face very harsh, very brutal, and very demanding circumstances. They usually work 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week in a very dangerous industrial city. Industrial work was difficult and was dangerous already because there are no safety precautions. There's no requirements for safety precautions. And if you're injured, you're fired. So they live in terrible conditions in the city. Their health is bad. So they really are some of the hardest working, but also really a group that is in the most danger during this period as well. Families struggle. Parents in the beginning began to work with their children in their workloads or during their work days, but countries began to ban child labor. England did in 1833. France did in 1841. Prussia does somewhere in there, like 1839, I think. Belgium a little bit later in 1842. So then you have to figure out what to do with the children. Factory owners oftentimes would rather hire women too, because they were less likely to be drunk, they were less likely to be rebellious and violent, and so then you could pay them less. So working women then have to make a decision about helping to support their family or taking care of their children. The eventually, you began to see the working class develop some sort of consciousness about trying to come up with ways to improve their lives. The problem is that anytime you got convicted or anytime you got associated with trying to start a union or trying to be rebellious, then you could end up being fired instantly and then blackballed where nobody else would hire you as well. The violence was, or trade unionism was never looked on very favorably by the managerial classes or by the upper classes. But and the problem is that it's very difficult for them to to lobby for better wages, better working conditions when they can be fired so easily. And so poverty is really going to become a major, I guess, association of the working classes, the working poor, as they know. So, as a result, in the middle classes, in the educated classes, there begins to be groups of people that emerge that are critical of the capitalistic society, that are critical of the way things are, and they're critical of the way the poor, the working poor, are treated. So some of these will be the early socialists. The socialism is really important as you read this. Make sure that you understand what the socialists are after here. There's a group like Henri de Saint Simon or Charles Fourier or even Robert Owen that are considered to be utopian socialists. It comes from Thomas More's Utopia. Utopia is a perfect society. Saint Simon, Fourier, Owen, they're all trying to build a perfect society. They're trying to use industrialization to improve the life for all the classes, to avoid social conflict, to create a humane society. And that's why it's called utopian socialism. They believe that the government has to step in, though, and do that, that there has to be cooperation, there has to be planning, that really the educated and the elite had to step in to make a conscious decision to make the lives better for the poor. Owen is one of these guys that actually put some of these ideas into practice. He creates a cotton mill at New Lanark in Scotland, and it is a model, really, community. Workers had high living standards, pleasant surroundings. They worked together. They had free education for their children. Okay, and it tend to work, but it doesn't. It's not repeatable. It doesn't happen in other places. Some of these guys have some beliefs though that get them into trouble. Fourier, for example, while he did believe that a unified economic system would bring about a humane society, and others are going to pick that up. But he also believed in total equality of the sexes and free love, and he denounced marriage really as a form of prostitution. And therefore, those sort of ideas were a little bit out there for that time period. Now, later, feminists and socialists would pick up those ideas, but in the early 1800s, those were pretty radical ideas. The And there you can see one of Fourier's ideas, the phalange. The uh, the other major critics of industrialization include Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx is Marx and Engels are famous for writing and publishing in 1848 the Communist Manifesto, which is really the development of the the Marx's and Engels, to some extent, socialist ideas. They're very much, especially Marx, was very much influenced by the philosopher Hegel. Hegel talked about dialectics, and in Hegel's dialectics, you have a conflict and a resolution. You have two ideas that are in conflict, and out of that conflict comes a resolution. And Marx saw that all of history was a history of class struggle. That in his case, or in his beliefs, it was the owning classes that he called the bourgeoisie, and the working classes that he called the proletariat, and they were fighting, and that all of history was really a history of class struggle. Marx, though, unlike a lot of his utopian brothers, believed that it would take violence for the workers to end private property, to end state controls, and to bring about a better society. That it would only come through revolution, violent upheaval, which is totally different than what the utopians were talking about. So Marx's Communist Manifesto is one of those landmarks of this development of the industrial society. Marx argued that once this happened, the workers would come together. Everybody would be a worker. Class struggle and class warfare would disappear because everybody would be working, and you would essentially have a perfect society. Those ideas, of course, are going to be very influential later on. So, as you read this chapter, make sure you understand that these are industrial impacts really on society. Even some of the industrial development, like in transportation and steam engines and things like that, do affect society. So, understand that this is kind of a closer look at the people that are a part of the Industrial Revolution.